hi everyone. I think since we don't have our first speaker here, we're going to switch the order of the speakers and have our second speaker go first and see if we can track down our first speaker. And so that means that we'll have Aisha Muhammad go, and I will let her kind of tell you more about herself and let her talk to you about her path and her experience.
Thanks, Megan. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay, can you guys see my slides okay? Perfect. So thank you for that introduction, Megan. As she said, my name is Aisha and I'm a G4 here at the MDPhD program at Vandy. And I actually, as I was preparing this presentation, spent a lot of time thinking about what a good title for this talk would be. And I decided to go with this just to highlight not only the manual journey that I've gone through in my scientific and personal growth, but also sort of the metaphorical journey. So in the theme of journey of a few thousand miles, let's start with the geography session. So I am from a country in South Asia called Pakistan. This is what it looks like, and this is the flag of Pakistan. And I was born in this teeny tiny city here, which will not be marked on most maps that you see of Pakistan unless you zoom in very closely. My dad was in the military, so we ended up moving a lot. So these are just some of the locations where I did my early middle school and high school education. I ended up doing my high school in this big city of Karachi, which, to give you some context, is more populated than New York City and is the largest city in Pakistan, even though it's not the capital. And moving to this big city from the small towns where I've lived all over my life, I don't think I would be here today if it weren't for my English teacher, whose picture I actually couldn't find online. So one of the things about growing up in Pakistan is that technological advances were a little behind. So we didn't take all our headshots in high school like they do now and put them online, you know? So I do have physical pictures of him, but I couldn't find an online picture. So he was actually my English teacher. Even though I was highly interested in science, because the way science was taught back home was basically what is known about the world, and they sort of impart that to you. And what is known about the world, if you know enough about enough pieces, makes sense logically. So that's something that I was always attracted to. And I wasn't very much into English or the arts or things like that. So my English teacher, he actually encouraged me that because I asked a lot of very, what he said, annoying questions, jokingly, that actually leads a lot of space for me to be in a creative field. And that's sort of how I got, and he was also the person who encouraged me to apply to school in the US. So I decided to move about 7,000 miles from Pakistan to the US for school. And I was just like, you know, I've seen a lot of How I Met Your Mother episodes. I've seen a lot of, you know, Hollywood stuff that they put out. How hard could it be? The answer was quite hard, and How I Met Your Mother didn't quite help. But that's just a random aside. So I went for my undergrad at Yale University in New Haven. And the people who were very important to my professional growth in New Haven were these two people in the chemistry department. So this gentleman right here is, he's now retired. He is the professor, he was the professor of a special course called Freshman Organic Chemistry. So because I was very much into the science, I actually have 4 years of high school biology, chemistry, physics and math, sort of pretty intense science background. So I was able to place into organic chemistry as a freshman. And he was the person who changed my perspective on science in terms of switching it from this is what is known about the world, here you go, to this is how we found out what we found out about the world. Here you go. So he was actually the person who really got me interested in thinking about research in the first place, which was almost 10 years ago now. And this gentleman right here was my director of undergraduate studies. And his name was Kurt Zelm. And his sort of claim to fame in my life is that he laid it down very clearly, both the good, the bad, and the ugly of science, a career in academia, and things like that. So one of the things that he said was, and I say that to a lot of people because I think that it put me it made me more prepared if he hadn't said that to me. So my sophomore year, when I was looking for a research mentor, because he was like, you should try this research thing, and the other professor had said that too, I emailed a bunch of people, and he said, Professor Zelm said to me, and I wasn't getting any responses from professors. So Professor Zelm said to me, I'm going to tell you something that might be a little hard to hear, but I'd rather tell you this than you just keep waiting for responses. We actually, professors get a lot of emails from random people looking at wanting research positions. And unfortunately, your name, so my last name is Mohammed, your name indicates that you're from a certain region where we get a lot of spam from as well. So there is a very good chance, I'm not saying this is happening, but there is a good chance that your emails are getting spam filtered and they're not even getting read. So you should go knock on doors to make a space for yourself. So I really appreciated sort of that very real perspective. And he didn't tell me that everything was going to be rosy and great. But he also sort of provided a solution for it, which I think was very helpful. This is one professor who I took Shakespeare with, actually. And the reason I'm super grateful to him is because he was the person who gave me the first C in my educational career ever. And that was sort of the first big step of the first big blow of failure, like academic failure that I'd had in my life. And I think because of his support, and the fact that he was willing to actually sit down with me with that paper and go through all of the sentences and all of the organization was the reason I eventually ended up with an A in the class. One, two, that showed me that if I put in work, it will actually get me somewhere. And three, it also prepared me a lot for graduate school because if you haven't discovered already, things don't always go the way you want them to in the lab. So I'm super grateful to Professor Manley, who taught comedies and romances of Shakespeare. And then these are the two people who actually helped me delve into research. So Professor Scott Strobel was running a MolBio lab, and he was also a part of the chemistry faculty in the chemistry department. And his lab was super big. So I maybe met with him like 2 or 3 times. But I mostly worked with who was this person who was at that point a postdoc, now as a faculty member, named Karen Roof, who I am super grateful for a lot of reasons. And one small reason was that Karen actually taught me how to use one of these things, and I had actually no idea what that was sophomore year of college. And I was touching everything without gloves on a wet lab bench. And she just was very patient with me and said, so first thing, we don't touch this space. We touch the space of the desks without gloves on, and then actually taught me how to use my first pipette pen. And I remember saying to her, so she taught me about apart from those things, one other very important lesson that I still use, which is if 3 things go wrong in the lab in one day, you go home. And that's because research life, you might have heard, is flexible, but it's flexible in the way that some weeks you might not have a lot of work, and some weeks you might have more work. than your average 40 hours, which is what most of professional America thinks of. And because of that built-in flexibility, in order to take care of your mental health and make sure you remain motivated, you also have to build in some personal flexibility. If three things go wrong in the lab, and that can include, breaking instruments, gel not running right, forgetting to pull a tape off on the Western blot, things like that, your plate colony failing, your cells are all dying when you don't need them to, you go home. And I still use that to this day. From Yale, I moved on to Boston because I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do med school. And as an international student, it's actually really hard to get into medical school in the US. So for some context around sophomore, so when I came to Yale, I was just like, I can do anything. And when I was pretty interested in science and I thought medicine was going to be the place. But when I went to the career office at Yale, they told me that if I'm an international, there is no chance in a million years that I was going to get into medical school. So for the first 2 years, I struggled a lot in terms of thinking about what else I could do if science wasn't something that I was going to do. At that point, I wasn't fully aware of the concept of a PhD. And MD PhD was something that wasn't so far away. It was probably in another galaxy. Like I was not aware of those concepts. So once I graduated, I was just like, okay, so this research thing seems cool. And towards the end of my college career, people seemed to think that I might have a shot in med school. So let me sort of think about things before I make a decision and try to apply, because the application process is actually a long process. And it's a year long, and it's strenuous, not only emotionally in terms of like thinking about interviewing and waiting for things, but also financially, which is something that I couldn't afford. So I moved to Boston, which is where I joined the lab of Dr. Jose Flores at Mass General. And this is another postdoc. She's now a junior faculty member who's an MD PhD. So both of these people were MD PhDs, who were very instrumental in sort of helping me decide, one, whether I wanted to do med school or not, and two, giving me the confidence that I could actually do MD PhD if I wanted. Because, like so far I'd been surrounded by people who'd been doing research, who one had like parents with, advanced degrees, and who'd been familiar with the concept of research way before high school even. And here I was, I'd only been in the US for 4 years, and I'd only started doing research 2 years ago. So like, who was I to think that I could get into an MD PhD program? So these two people were very important in giving me the confidence, and then also the logistics of, applying to med school, reading through my applications, giving me feedback, things like that. Jose was part of the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT. And at the Broad Institute, they had this person, who will become relevant in a little bit, come and give a talk at the population genetics program there. And I was mesmerized. This was talking about sequencing every patient. This talk was talking about sequencing every patient and preemptively figuring out, what diseases they might have, how they might respond to medications. And I was just like, whoa, I was working with bacteria mutating one gene at a time. Like, this is like a whole different, ball game, whole different league, I think is the appropriate sports analogy here. So with Jose and Miriam's confidence and sort of the motivation that this talk provided, I knew I was in love with genetics, but I was convinced that, I can try to do an MD PhD. That is what I'm going to try to do. So I applied to multiple different MD PhD programs, and actually ended up deciding to go from the Northeast, where I'd spent my entire American life, to what real Southerners will not call the South, but was the South to me, Nashville, Tennessee. And I was thinking, you know what? I've been in America for 6 years now, I got this. Like, how hard could it be? I'm familiar with the culture, this is going to be fine. Plot twist, the culture of the Northeast is very different from the culture of the South, even if it's a liberal place like Nashville. And that was something that I had to adjust to. But with the support of some wonderful people, so this is my class, and this is at our white coat ceremony, I think I was able to do that fairly well. Transitions are always hard, but it was some of these people are going to be my friends for the rest of my life. And I definitely know that some of these people are going to be people I refer my patients to, or I collaborate in my research with. So that was actually one of the reasons that I also chose Vanderbilt in the first place, is that sense of community, which I think is very important, particularly when you're making transitions. And if you're thinking about an MD PhD, or something in either the MD or the PhD space, you learn about these buzzwords. And one of them is lifelong learning. So you're going to be learners for the rest of your life, and you're going to be transitioning a lot as electronic health records change, as technologies change, as you move between positions. So community to sort of help you with those transitions is, at least to me, was super important. So in Nashville, guess who I found? So this person's name is Dr. Dan Roden, and he is the person who I chose to be my PhD mentor. And even though he is my primary PhD mentor, and I don't think I'd be anywhere without his help and support, he actually had a lot of people, junior faculty and postdocs in his lab, who provided me both formal and informal mentorship. And the great thing about Dan was that his sort of thinking about this is your PhD. Let me know how I can support you, and you go do your thing and talk to me about it. And the great thing about that is that I started looking at projects with all three of these people, to sort of, one, get a perspective of people later on in their career versus earlier on in their career. And also to, I don't know, I was in a space where everything was shiny and everything was great. So it actually also helped me diversify my my sort of scientific repertoire. And I'm actually super grateful for this, because as it will become relevant in a bit, if I hadn't sort of partnered up with these people, and these people hadn't taken me in and mentored me, I might not be graduating anytime soon. So, so with all the excellent support that I had in Dan's lab, and I'm going to focus mostly my story on the PhD side, for the reason that I knew what an MD was when I was thinking about applying, or when I graduated from college. I had seen doctors back home. I knew what doctors were. I had some idea, but I had no idea what the day-to-day of research was like before I'd sort of joined my lab in college. And so I think because the PhD is, at least in my life, wasn't as prevalent as the MD, there were more lessons that I learned here that weren't immediately obvious to me. So I'll focus mostly on the PhD part. So I came in super starry-eyed, super excited. I'm going to do my PhD in human genetics in Dan's lab, and it's going to be great. And one of the things that my freshman organic chemistry professor said, which I didn't understand about lab until I actually started thinking about my PhD, is something that he told us when we were talking about logistics way back in the fall of 2010, when we were starting the freshman organic chemistry class. So I'm just going to play a 5-second video from him. So that's a question that actually remained with me for a very long time, because my understanding of science and research was like, you go out and you discover things. But it's actually, I think reframing it was really helpful in the sense that things are already out there. You just you need to, in order to find something, you need to answer the question, how do you know that this thing is already out there? And I think approaching research with that question, where, let's say gene A leads to disease B, how do you know that gene A leads to disease B? That is the main question that I think we think about in research. So you come up with ideas, and that is the question that you need to address. So let me see. Okay, perfect. So in my lab, we work on the electrical activity that's in the heart. And we know from previous research studies that genetics influences genetics. So your genome influences the electrical activity that's in your heart. But we don't really know what the mechanism is. And I had an idea about what the mechanism is. So I wanted to try and figure out, is my idea of this mechanism being how genetics influence electrical activity correct or not? So coming back to that idea of how will I show, or how will I know that my idea is correct or not, I decided to test out my idea in a model of what we called human-derived heart cells. So what happens is that you take in a patient's blood, you take white blood cells from that patient's blood, you deprogram them, so you make them forget that they're white blood cells, and then you sort of brainwash them into thinking that they're heart cells. And what that does is that gives you the whole genome of the patient who's interesting to you, and it gives you an actual model, a cellular human model to test out your ideas in. So super excited about my proposal. Presented it to my thesis committee, who were like, "This sounds like a really cool project. You have our approval to start doing research, or start doing experiments and things like that." And then often you'll find out that science will go something like this story is going to go. So my thesis was just like, had a mind of its own, and was just like, no, we're not gonna make this straightforward for you. So one of the problems, for example, we had is that I couldn't get my cells to live for like about 9 months. And out of those 6 out of those 9 months, so I was making cells like almost every week, and they were dying every 2 weeks after I started making them. And this happened for about 9 months. And we realized that for 6 of those 9 months, our incubators were broken and there was no alarm. And then after we got the incubators fixed, COVID happened. And COVID also had a mind of its own. So both of them literally took me and treated me like the sponge that is depicted in this picture. And I was essentially left with not being able to do anything. Like, it's one thing if things slow down, but my project essentially came to a screeching halt. So then what ended up happening is that these two people who I introduced earlier, so Dr. Sarah Van Dries, who's both of these people are MD PhDs, Dr. Sarah Van Dries and Dr. Jonathan Mosley. I'd been talking to these people before about, what things they were working on, and if I could help out on some of the things. And their big thing was that, and I talked to Dan about it, and Dan had said in a very accepting manner, your PhD, you get to choose what you learn. And I was super grateful for that, because, that it showed me how he could have very easily said, no, you focus on this thing, try to solve this problem. But he showed immense flexibility in a time that wasn't easy for a lot of us, right? Like COVID wasn't easy for a lot of us. So super grateful for that. And as a result of, with Dan's blessing and with Sarah and Jonathan's approval, I started working on this project where we know that genetics influence how patients respond to medications. So two people might take the same amount of Tylenol for pain that they're feeling, and one person might recover immediately. and the other person might need additional Tylenol. And a third person might actually end up, getting some side effects from the Tylenol. So basically, the idea was that we know that genomics affect people's response to medication, but we don't know how much they affect people's response to medication. It is just something that's like a small thing and we can ignore, or like, will genomics determine 80% of how a person is going to respond to something? So I was a little bummed in the sense that, like, my fancy project with all these like deprogrammed and reprogrammed cells was not going. Um, but I started working on this, and even though I wasn't very optimistic about this stuff, people around me showed more faith in me than I had in myself, and I actually got recognition for this with Sarah and Jonathan's help at a national level. And I'm going to brag a little bit, but my first author paper just got published. Here's the QR code for that. And then, I did this, but I hadn't talked to my thesis committee about this. They were thinking I was going to do something else with heart cells and electrical activity. And that's where sort of I learned another lesson is that, and I'm super grateful to all these people who are very flexible and were like, this is your PhD, and we are actually in your corner to help you become a scientist. So we will help you with the obstacles that you're having with your cells, but this has clearly shown some scientific growth and, starting from a project and then getting it published. So they are very happy with my progress, which is super nice and validating, because I suffer a lot from imposter syndrome, and I'm actually on track to graduate, which I'm super excited about. So hopefully med school, I'm starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and med school is not too far away. So based on those sort of 20-ish minutes, I hope, or I guess 25, I have some advice on how to survive and thrive. And I'm always happy to answer questions, both in this forum, but also after. My first piece of advice is it's okay not to do something that's like not flashy. So a lot of us, so I went to, Yale for undergrad, and then I was at Harvard for my postgrad research. And then I came here. So I've been very privileged to be at very, esteemed institutions. And you tend to get into a mindset of, like, I need to go and chase prestige down. And even if you're not explicitly wording it that way, you realize that it becomes a factor in the decisions that you make. So for example, I've heard someone say, I'm wasting my excellent resume on doing a clinical specialty that's not very competitive. So it's okay to do something that's otherwise not flashy. And especially when you're surrounded by, your world's going to keep getting smaller as you progress in life, and you're more surrounded by more people who are going to be super successful and super awesome. And if you're like me, you're going to feel imposter syndrome a lot, and then you're going to be like, maybe I should try to do, be the best person that I am in this one thing, and like go to, but that's okay. Like, just try to follow things that make more sense to you than sense to you in factors that are other than prestige or things like that. So as your world gets smaller and you're surrounded by these super awesome people, I do this, and I'm working very hard on not to do this, which is I try to compare myself to other people, and it's a terrible idea, right? So as I said earlier, there are people who started this program whose parents both had advanced degrees. They were doing research since before I even knew what research was. They were thinking about MD-PhD programs before I even came to this country and knew what an MD-PhD program was. So their path is going to look a lot different from what my path is going to be. So I constantly remind myself that, comparison is not fair. But again, it's easier said than done. The other thing is, I was very fortunate in that my mentors, every person who has been around me, my committee, have all had my back. And a reason for that is a reason for that is I'm very open in terms of having the hard conversations. So I would encourage you to have the hard conversations when you're trying to look for mentors and stuff like that. Because if you have the hard conversations when things around you are not hard, you're not going to be afraid to ask for help when things around you do get hard. So COVID happened last year, our labs shut down, people lost jobs, people lost loved ones, like things got pretty hard around the world in general. Like I wasn't able to see my family. I still haven't seen my family in 2 years almost. Um, and if I weren't feeling comfortable with these people before COVID happened, it'd be hard for me to try to ask them for help when COVID happened. So I would encourage you to, have those conversations and find people around you who have your back. And in line with that, um, now that I've gone through a global pandemic, hopefully when I'm a PI, well, hopefully there's not going to be another global pandemic, but realistically, if there's another global pandemic and I'm a PI and I have some grad student, right? Like I want to be able to remember what I needed when I needed it and how I was struggling when I was struggling, just so that I can sort of follow the next piece of my own advice. That sounds pompous, but um, all these people who helped me I can't give anything to them. They're higher up. They've made it through their careers. They have more experience. So I can't sort of pay them back. But what I can do is I can take what they give me very generously, and I can give back to people um, ahead of me. So, talking to younger students as yourself, and if you have any questions about, what's it like to be an international student? How did you decide to do an MD-PhD program? What attracted you to Vanderbilt? So remember to sort of, give back to people coming after you. And one thing that I used to feel a lot is that I used to feel very guilty asking for help from my mentors because I was like, I can pay them back. Like they like have all the experience and everything. So try not to feel guilty if you're going to take their advice forward and, sort of give it to the quote next generation. And the last thing is don't lose who you are as a person. Again, your worlds are going to get smaller. You're going to be surrounded by people who are super awesome and doing all the same kind of things. Um, but I'd like to think of this just because it helps me sort of recognize my own privilege, right? Like I have a lot of friends who are still back home and were super talented. Maybe some of them, not maybe, some of them are probably smarter than me and harder working than me, and but I have this opportunity, and that comes with sort of great privilege, right? That I'm here at at a world leading institution. I was one of the first people in the world to get a COVID shot. Like my mom just got it 2 weeks ago, and I got it back in January. Um, so it's important to sort of keep that perspective and sort of maintain a life outside of the academy. That was a very rushed version of, what I did. I could definitely talk about anything that you feel interested in a lot. But I do want to say that it takes a village, and I couldn't be here without a lot of the people that I've mentioned and I haven't mentioned. And this is a representation of some of my village. And this village looks very different. There are people and non-people in here, right? Like I am very thankful to all the non-human species that I have in my life because they provide support and sometimes that is much needed after a failed experiment. Um, but I at that's sort of a brief summary of my journey, and I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so I do see that there's a question in the chat. Um, did you already have programming experience prior to your genomics project? And what advice would you give to someone starting out with programming and applying it to bioinformatics. So thank you, Mariah. I'm not really sure how to pronounce your name, so please feel free to unmute yourself and correct me. I'm going to wait if you are able to unmute yourself.
It's Mariah.
Mariah, perfect. So thank you for that question, Mariah. I did have one coding class from undergrad, because junior year, someone told me you're not going to get a job as an international student unless you get into coding. I did that one coding class, but that was also the time when someone told me you might still have a chance to get into med school. So I still had all my pre-med requirements. So that one coding class was the beginning and end of my programming experience. I think the advice that I have for someone who's starting out with programming is that the learning curve is very steep. And there's different types of ways to approach a steep learning curve. So for example, I'll take it to standardized testing. MCAT is a difficult test, right? The approach that you'll take to getting that learning curve with MCAT is very different from the approach you'll take to this. So my approach to programming was, I need to be able to have the tools to answer my own questions, because I'm going to keep learning, because programming languages are going to keep changing. People are going to keep coming up with new packages and stuff like that. So instead of learning how to do one particular thing that you need to do, think about developing sort of skills that you can translate to other. So for example, I have a data set and I want to draw a bar plot. Instead of just thinking about like, how do I make a bar plot? Think about, is this data in the right format? And how do I manipulate this data to make it to a bar plot? Because that way you'll think about data manipulation and stuff that you can then manipulate to make a violin plot, make a histogram, make a, dot and box and whisker plot. You can make, whatever, density plot, whatever. So I would think about higher level skills as opposed to think about smaller tasks, but the smaller tasks are also important to keep you motivated and keep you going, so that, because eventually you do have to make that bar plot. So finding that balance between higher level skills and sort of the task list that you have at hand. The next question is by Christelle. I'm also an international student and I'm considering doing an MD-PhD. And I was wondering, what do you think made your application stand out when you were applying in spite the high competition? So that's an excellent question, and one that maybe Megan can answer better, because as I mentioned, I do suffer from imposter syndrome a little bit. So sometimes I really wonder, did you guys make the right decision picking me as a part of this community? I think one thing that I have always taken an approach, I have always done in terms of approaching these things, is whatever I've done it with an all-in sort of approach. So I think like there's a lot of people that I was surrounded by in college who had maybe 3 times as many things on their resume as I had. But what I ended up doing, so for example, I ended up working with the chaplain's office a lot. And I did that because I fell in love with that community and I wasn't looking to get a CV marker out of it. I ended up going all in. That became my community. I enjoyed doing the things that I did. And as a result, that inspired ideas to improve the programs. And people saw that. Like, people are going to be able to see at some point if you're sort of faking it or if you're like really committed to it. So that's one thing that I would suggest, because I think my experiences there weren't a lot of them, but they were in depth. And I thought through them a lot. So the other thing I highly recommend to people who are applying to MD or MD PhD programs is, like thinking about the why and the how do you know, if tying it back into the theme. So if you like science, the country is in need of a lot of great science teachers, right? Like the vaccine hesitancy that we've seen for COVID is a very prime manifestation of how much this country is lacking good science education. So if you like science, why particularly medicine? If you like helping people, there's a lot of ways of helping people. So also sort of think about, how do you know that you want to do an MD versus an MD PhD? What's gonna add in doing that you can't get from alternative pathways? If you want to take care of patients, like, nursing is a very noble way to take care of patients, and the training is much shorter. Like, PAs have a great experience taking care of patients. I've worked with a lot of PAs. So thinking in depth about the decisions that you've made and sort of going in with an all-in approach. Megan, I do want to be mindful of the time. So
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think we'll have that be the last question
Okay.
for Aisha, and then we'll move on to our second speaker, Courtney. So thank you so much, Aisha, for sharing your story and your background.
Check out our website to find recordings of all of our videos. We'll get them posted about a week after each of the presentations. We can't wait to see you!